All right. I'm happy to be with you all. Welcome to Common Places Church. Week 6 in Colossians. Next week, Steph Alexander will wrap up the book of Colossians. We gave her the part that's all of the names, as Paul says goodbye, because I didn't know how to pronounce them. And so, anyway, you don't want to miss that. So, I want to start today with a thought experiment. Imagine that you are a first century, you live in a first century Greek household, all right? If you were a woman, you were given in marriage, quite possibly, as a teenager to a man, maybe by your parents to broker a business deal. By Roman law, your husband owns you. You are his property. He can beat you. He can use you in whatever capacity he wants. You have no voice. You can't represent yourself legally. You are his property. Your job in that culture and time was to keep the home, bear his children, grow his legacy. He can sleep with whoever he wants, but if you do that, it's going to go quite badly. Love is not really a term that's expected to even play a part in many of the Greek homes at that time. The idea that your marriage was a loving relationship probably never crossed your mind. It was an arrangement created to leverage your husband's power over you, and this was a common Greek experience. In Jewish homes, if they had read Torah well and understood it, they would be a little bit better off, perhaps, but it was still a difficult time to be a woman. And imagine that you were a kid in this home. You also are your dad's legal property. In fact, if you were born a girl, congratulations on surviving, because women were not valued in society. They couldn't produce heirs. And so sometimes you would just abandon baby girls on the streets because you didn't want one. But if you happened to survive that, your father, even if you were a son in this context, your father owned you as well. There was a particular Roman law that said until the day your dad died, he had complete authority over you. He could even inflict capital punishment on you if he so desired. Your property was his property. If you were a man in this environment, you had a lot of power. In fact, you probably owned a few slaves, and your home operates in this way. And now this is where things are going to get weird, all right? If you already thought this is a very strange way to start a sermon. You in this story, any of these characters that you want to relate to, you get invited to a guy named Epaphras' house, all right? And you go to his home, you know him, he's an acquaintance, and at his home, he begins to tell you about a man named Jesus. And there's something begins to happen in your heart, and you see the world a little differently, and you realize that you can be loved and forgiven by God. And you just change. Like, there's something that happens in your heart when you're at this little house gathering that changes you, and you decide that you want to be part of this new family that Epaphras is talking about, that this Jesus is the real deal, and that you trust him, and you know that stuff at home isn't right, and you don't know why, but it's not filling you with joy, and this message of Jesus seems to bring some joy to you. And so you decide that you're going to be part of this new way of living, with all of your messy home life, with all of your broken family dynamics. You are now a Christian. You don't even have a label yet to put on that, but you're following this Jesus character. And at that moment, if we've been reading Colossians, we know that at that moment, your roots begin to go down into the ecosystem of the soil of Jesus' love. You don't really understand what it's going to mean yet for you, and it's beautiful, and it's scary, and you've got this new identity as a Jesus person. Now you still go home, the small group wraps up, somebody prays, or maybe they sing a song, I don't know, and your life is changed, but you don't really know what the implications of it are going to be. You go back home to your wife or your slaves or your kids, and you're wondering as you walk home, what does this mean for me? Now that I'm a Jesus person and I'm trying to figure that out, what does it mean? I had a playbook to live by when I was at the center of my life, and that playbook, if you were a woman, might have been a survival playbook to just get through one day at a time. It might have been a power-abusing playbook. As a man, it could have been a traumatic playbook as a kid where you avoided situations that could lead to your abuse. But you know that something is different now, and you're pretty sure that all of these relationships that are in your life, like they don't go away. You're still a kid, or you're still a wife, or you're still a husband. You still go back and own slaves, right? And you're wondering to yourself, what's different now? How does my relationship in these different places in my life change? And versions of this scenario were playing out all over the Roman world as the gospel, the good news of Jesus, began to spread. And people were trusting Jesus, and their lives were like so unique and different and challenging, and they were trying to figure out what it means to follow the one that they decided to trust. I'm going back to a quote from Tim Keller that we read in week 1. It says this: "It's very common in the church to think as follows. The gospel is for non-Christians. One needs it to be saved. But once you're saved, then you grow through hard work and obedience. But the Bible shows that this is a mistake. All of our problems come from a failure to apply the gospel." And so if you are in this scenario, you are desperately hoping that this new way of living has some instructions for you, because you just don't know what to do when you go home to the situations that you live in. And you're hoping that there's some more good news, not just the good news that you've been forgiven and adopted into God's family, but that there's some good news for how to live this out as well. And so you go back to your house church the next week or the next day, and you've got questions. And this time there's a letter there from a guy named Paul. You've never met this Paul fellow, but you've heard that Paul was an important part of Epaphras' journey to Jesus. And in this letter, as they sit around in this home and they read it out loud, you are reminded all over again of how much Jesus loves you and how much you love him. And you remember that Jesus always acts in line with his character. And maybe you've had a rough week or a rough month or a rough year, and you're like, I don't always act in line with who I am, but Jesus is good, and you're reminded that he's love. And you remember, like as we have gone through Colossians, the things that Paul has said are things like, Jesus delivered us from darkness, and Jesus transformed us, and he redeemed us, and he makes us sufficient. He qualifies us. He chose us, and he loved you, and he forgave you. And that part about being forgiven, like it feels really good because, just this past week, if you were in that context, you may have gone home and beat your kid because that's just the playbook you had. Your dad beat you, but this time it thought to yourself, like, this doesn't feel right. Like, I don't know why, but for some reason it feels different. Like, I don't think I should be doing this thing. Maybe on Wednesday you were going downtown to visit the temple prostitute, like you always did on a Wednesday. And on your way to visit your favorite temple prostitute, you just started to feel like gross about it. And you've never felt gross about it before. And you don't know, why is it that I feel so different about this thing in my life that I've always done. And at home, you're looking at your wife in a different way than you've ever done, and you're wondering if maybe this Jesus has something to say about the way I should interact with her. And so you show up at this Bible study, and you're desperate for some hope, right? I hope that there's something to know about what this good news means for me in my everyday life, because it feels really pertinent right now, and I need to know what I should do. So what does it mean about us? It means that you realize that you are loved, and you are forgiven, and you're welcome into God's family. Now, what does it mean for me to live in this way? And those questions don't change. Like, as we go through life, the scenarios in which we live change or add on. So I needed to learn what it means to follow Jesus as just a guy, as a single guy. And then I got married, and I had to learn to figure out what does it mean to love Jesus and be in a marriage. And then we had kids, and I thought, now I got to figure out what it means to love Jesus and to love my wife and also to be a dad. And then somewhere in there, I was a pastor, and now I lead this church, and I'm like, every step of the way, I'm discovering that there's something new about a way that I can learn from and experience Jesus in my life. What does it look like? What kind of fruit is my life supposed to bear in all of these different areas of my life? How do I do these things in a way that's filled with the power and good news of Jesus? Today's passage that we're going to look at, in my Bible, it has a label on it, and the title going into it is Rules for Christian Households. And that was not Paul's heading for his text that was a publishing team's decision. Sometime, there was a group of theologians who sat down and said, what title should we put on this part of the Bible? And somebody at the table said, let's call it Rules, because Christians, we love our rules, right? That's a good label for it, right? You would think they had not read the book of Colossians up to this point, and how we've already talked about how it's not Jesus plus rules, it's Jesus only, like it's just Jesus at the core of all it is. And then how about this first verse that we get to jump into today? We'll just put it up there. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. In sermon writing, they tell us that a good sermon has something in the opening that makes the critic a problem that you need to have solved. Well, Paul does that for me here, right off the bat. How's that verse sit with you ladies? What does it feel like inside when you read that? Like angst, joy, fear, confusion, like any number of emotions might be connected with that text. Maybe in your own story, for some of the ladies here, that verse has been leveraged against you to justify mistreatment or abuse. Or you've been limited in what you were allowed or able to do in life because someone interpreted that in a way that demeaned or belittled you. I've got good news for you today. That's bad interpretation, all right? We'll get into what would be appropriate in this case. But all that to say is, like, this is not rules for Christian life. What we're about to learn is it is the gospel for our lives as well. Let's read the next verse. Husbands, love your wives, and don't be harsh with them. I love that the stretch goal for husbands is don't be harsh. I feel like there should be something more there. All right, let's talk about submission here, about this word submit. In Roman households, at the time when this was written, a woman was expected to obey. Remember, you are your husband's property. You don't get a choice in that. It's who you are. From the moment you are married to this man, he owns you. And so it would have been expected in this culture for Paul to say, wives, obey your husbands. Like, just do what he says. But the word that Paul uses here is submission, and it has baked into it this idea that it's voluntary. Now, this was breathtaking to women at this time. The idea that they had a choice in the matter was unheard of for them. Submission, now when I hear the word submission, I was never a wrestler, or, I was always a scrawny little kid, so, it reminds me of somebody wanting to play mercy with me, or I got me in a headlock and they're saying, do you submit? That's a beautiful picture of marriage, and what God had intended there, right? That there's this thing I don't want to do, but I've got to do it because I've got no other options, and so I submit, right? I've just read the book of Colossians, and that picture does not fit into anything that I've read so far. If you read Ephesians, if you read any of Paul's writings, you discover that the guy likes to copy and paste. All right? So when you can read almost verbatim what he writes here in the book of Ephesians. But in Ephesians, he adds some flavor to it that's really helpful in understanding this. In Ephesians, there's a verse right before this. In Ephesians, it actually says, wives, to your husbands as to the Lord. It doesn't say the word submit because it's inferring the word from the previous verse. And the previous verse in Ephesians says this. I don't have it in here, but you can look it up. He's writing to all of the Christians, and Paul says, hey, Christians, you should all y'all ought to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. In other words, my job is to live in a way that puts other people's priorities above my own. This is not just a value for wives to have. This is a value for the people of God to have. That we are the kinds of people, like Jesus, who esteem others as greater than ourselves. And this is not a we must. This is an activity that we are invited to participate in. This is a family value. Just like the verse for the husbands, husbands love your wives, does not mean that wives get off without having to love their husbands, right? No, of course we expect and want wives to also love their husbands as well. I think a helpful definition for submission, in my understanding at least, is that I'm leveraging my power and my resources for you Taking this from Andy Stanley. My priorities are your priorities. When I officiate weddings, I often say, in a marriage ceremony, both parties are saying to one another, you are more important than I am, and I'm giving you my independence as a gift of my love. And that kind of a promise only works when both people make that promise to one another. Andy Stanley says that marriage is a submission competition. I thought that was a funny way to describe it. So anytime a man pulls this out as some sort of a trump card to justify exercising authority in a way that's oppressive, he has completely misunderstood the gospel as it has been presented to us. And while for us, when we read this text, the part that is so hard for us to grasp is that first verse. That was the easy verse. That actually liberated women in the first century. The showstopper, the hold on, Paul, back it up, is the second part, when husbands are supposed to love their wives. Love in many Greek households was not really an ingredient in the marriage relationship. Women would have been overjoyed to know that any deference towards their husband was a voluntary part of being in God's kingdom and not a mandatory. In fact, once submission becomes mandatory, it loses the word loses its meaning, because it's baked in as this idea that I get to choose to esteem you in this way. We live in a way that God's family lives this out. The power of a man over a woman was so pervasive in Jesus' day that in Matthew 19, Jesus is instructing his disciples that they really should stick with their wives. In that culture, men could divorce their wives for whatever they wanted. A new model of woman came along, somebody younger, they didn't like her meal. There was great opportunity to divorce women. Women could not divorce their husbands for any reason. And Jesus is telling his disciples, that kind of power is bad. You shouldn't do that. You should stick with your woman. And his disciples, the very men that Jesus was working the closest with, turn to him and they say, well, if that's the case, we probably shouldn't even get married. It astonishes me that kind of selfless love, even Jesus' own disciples had a hard time understanding that concept. And yet the gospel went into these places all over the Greek world, and Jewish husbands were becoming followers of Jesus, and Greek husbands were following Jesus, and their lives were being changed. And suddenly they were looking at each other in ways they never looked at each other, and they're starting to love each other, and they're starting to put other people's needs ahead of their own needs. And if you were a family that attended this house church in that time, and you're a kid there, and you're watching your mom and dad look at each other as this verse is being read, and their eyes are like, what is going on? And you're thinking, whoa, this Jesus is going to change everything. Maybe mom and dad will actually like each other. The fruit of this new soil that our family is discovering has in it, in the soil of Jesus, there is love and there is deference for the other. And that's never been in the soil of our lives before this. And now we're beginning to experience it in real ways. This was beautiful, transforming truth. Verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything. If you're a kid there that day, you're like, yeah, I get that. Dad will probably beat me if I don't, right? But then Paul says, because this pleases the Lord. And fathers, don't provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. And as a kid in this church gathering, you're starting to get choked up. Not because you were told that you should obey. You know you're supposed to obey. Dad's made that clear to you from the very beginning of your life. But the idea that your dad might actually care about your emotional state, and your future well-being, that he would not be a dad who discourages you, but he would actually be a dad that encourages you and wants the best for you. He's not going to push your buttons to get some kind of a response, but rather love is the root of all that he does. And you're realizing that maybe the reason your dad can do this is because your dad is loved by his Father in heaven. And as your dad comes to know how much his Heavenly Father loves him, it begins to change the way that he loves his own kids. And this is the fruit of the gospel in their lives. Your response to your parents as a child in this culture is suddenly you're thinking, not thinking what pleases me, but rather you're thinking, what would please Jesus in this moment? In all of these, what we might say are commands, it's always anchored in who Jesus is. It's always just like an expression of the kinds of things Jesus would do as well. Verse 22 gets a little dicey here. Didn't think it was dicey already. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for man, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. There's that anchoring it in Jesus again. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there's no partiality. And masters, treat your servants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Now you would think Paul should have just said, let all the slaves go free. End of story. He didn't have any political authority to make that kind of a statement, but in other places in the Bible, he does advocate for their freedom. Slavery in the first century is not quite the same animal that it was in the last couple hundred years of American history. In first century slavery situations, sometimes people sold themselves into slavery to pay a debt. Some slaves chose to be under the care of a master. Other slaves in this context were doctors and educators. And some, I am quite confident, were abused and terrorized. And it was a diverse landscape. It was part of the economic playing field of the day. And so Paul's words to masters here is that masters need to treat their servants justly and fairly. And I would have to think that if justice and fairness meant their freedom, then they should free them. And if they want to continue to be a part of your family, then treat them in a way recognizing that you also have a master who is in heaven as well. When you preach a text like this, you're trying to draw cultural equivalence to what we might experience today. And so while it is not the same, and I'm honest about that, I'm very glad that we live in a time when we don't own other human beings. We are still operating in economic realities where we have an employee-employer-boss relationship. And I would like to think that the same thing, some of these ideas and values should translate to those things. That as employees, we work hard not to get ahead or to people please our boss, but because we know that we have a Jesus in our hearts who calls us to live this way. And we do all that we do with him in mind. And as people with authority in employment situations, as a boss or as an owner of a company, the way in which we engage with those under our care is one in which we remember that we have an authority in our lives who is watching everything that we do. We have a master in heaven as well. We work hard as employees not to win favor, but we are motivated by a love for Jesus. I'm convinced that this passage here should not be called rules for Christian households, but the gospel for Christian households, like good news for Christian households. This passage sets women free in the first century. It gave men responsibility. It challenged the abusive employment norms of the day. And it urged fathers to love and to encourage their children. All of this was radically opposed to the current culture and deeply formative in setting apart what a Christian home looked like from a traditional Greek or even Jewish families. That as the people of God began to live this out, their home lives began to look way different than the home lives of their neighbors. And it was one of the things that compelled people to love and to trust Jesus. And yes, we will have to remind ourselves again and again of who we are in Jesus. The roots of our lives tend to wander in the soil, right, at times. But the goal is never try harder. It's always remember who we are and go deeper into Jesus. I'm not going to pretend that it's always easy to love our wives or respect our husbands or obey our parents or our bosses. We're always stretched in new and challenging ways. But the way through it all is always surrendered to Jesus. He's always enough. And we'll remember that our identities are not found in our ability to parent or be a good wife or an awesome husband or an excellent boss or employee. These are roles that we inherit as we go through life. They're not value statements about us. I like to think of these spheres of influence as like the branches of a tree on which our lives have the opportunity to bear fruit. The fruit is Jesus. How do I bear the fruit of Jesus as a dad, and as a husband, and as a pastor, and whatever your sphere of influence looks like? What does the fruit of Jesus' life look like there? And so I want this to be a hope-filled message today for the overwhelmed parent, the exhausted kid, the challenged marriage, the overworked employee. Put your energy into the soil of Jesus, not behavior modification. Trust Jesus. Don't try harder. Jesus wants your yes in every way. And so I hope that I was able to add some cultural flavor to this text today in a way that challenged you wherever you find yourself in. But it is good news. It is good news for God's people to put our roots in the soil of Jesus and to watch that then live itself out in all of the relationships that we have. I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to sing a song or two in conclusion. Let's close our eyes, because it helps me concentrate. And Jesus, I'm going to ask that you might bring to our mind any place in our lives, like any relational dynamic, where we're feeling the stress of not knowing what to do, or it's dysfunctional, and you kind of feel at the end of your rope. And the playbook that you've been working with is not working very well. Would you remind us that you're there in that? You see it and you know it. That whatever that label is that you're thinking about, it is not the truest thing about you. The truest thing about you is you are loved by Jesus Christ. And he loves you even if you aren't a great dad or a great wife or a great kid or a great employee. That never changes. And now, by your Spirit, would you show us what it looks like in our lives to trust you in a new way in this place? Would you put love where maybe there's not any love right now? Would you put a desire to think of others as more important than ourselves in a place where that's really hard to do? And help us to trust Jesus in this, and then to experience the fruit of a new life. This is my blessing on this church, Lord, including myself. I pray the power of your Spirit would enable us to do this through the powerful name of Jesus Christ. Amen.